We mean nothing to you, huh? My brother yelled, his face turning a blotchy red with fake outrage as I calmly refused to host another family dinner. God, Elijah, you were completely cold. My parents snapped from the couch, glaring at me like I had just committed a crime. I didn't flinch. I just smiled, completely unfazed by their theatrics. Trust me, I care, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. Then, I reached into my pocket, placed my phone flat on the coffee table, and pressed play. My family's smug, entitled expressions cracked like cheap glass as their own voices filled the room, exposing the ugly, calculated truth they thought I never knew about. Before I tell you about the satisfying, dramatic end to this mess, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. The living room of my home felt suffocating, as though the oxygen had been slowly siphoned out of the space over the last hour. The air was thick, heavy with the sharp, artificial scent of pine needles from the towering Christmas tree in the corner, and the bitter, unspoken tension radiating from the three people sitting across from me. My brother, Matthew, stood near the brick fireplace. He was 35, 3 years older than me, but in that moment, he looked exactly like a petulant child who had just been told he couldn't have a toy he felt entitled to. His jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles feathering beneath his skin, and his hands were curled into tight, aggressive fists at his sides. He had perfected this look over the years, the wounded, righteous victim who was somehow always being wronged by everyone else's boundaries. You are tearing this family apart, Matthew spat, his voice echoing off the hardwood floors and vibrating against the glass of the picture window. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled, expensive haircut, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. Over what, Elijah? Because you don't feel like cooking a turkey? Because you want to be selfish and sit around doing nothing while the rest of us actually try to maintain some traditions? My mother, Catherine, sat perched on the very edge of the tufted velvet sofa, her posture rigid and unforgiving. She wore her usual expression of deep, aristocratic disappointment. It was the exact same look she gave teenage cashiers who were too slow at the grocery store, or waiters who dared to bring her the wrong vintage of wine at a restaurant. I raised you better than this, Elijah, she said, her voice dropping to that lethal, quiet tone she used when she wanted a verbal strike to truly draw blood. Family makes sacrifices. Family shows up when it matters. But you just quit. You throw a tantrum and walk away from your responsibilities like a petulant child. It is honestly pathetic to watch. You are cold. Ice cold. Next to her sat my father, David. He didn't look at me. He never did when things got ugly. He just stared down at his expensive leather loafers, letting out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, though he never actually lifted a finger to help carry it. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his chest, offering the silent, passive agreement that had empowered my mother and brother for my entire adult life. He was the anchor of their toxicity, never throwing a punch himself, but always holding me down so they could land theirs without consequence. I stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe leading into the hallway, my arms crossed lightly over my chest. My pulse was steady. It was a strange, almost intoxicating feeling. For the first time in my 32 years on this earth, my hands were not shaking in their presence. I didn't feel the desperate, clawing need to explain myself. I didn't feel the overwhelming urge to apologize, to smooth things over, to beg for their understanding so the yelling would stop. That version of Elijah was dead. They had killed him, slowly, methodically, over a decade of ungrateful dinners, endless criticisms, and calculated insults. So that is your final word? Matthew demanded, taking an aggressive step toward me. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate me, a tactic that had worked wonders when we were teenagers. You are just going to abandon us on the holidays? You are going to punish your own flesh and blood because you are feeling a little tired from chopping some vegetables? Punish you? I echoed, letting out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach my eyes. The sound seemed to startle them. Matthew, asking grown adults to figure out how to feed themselves for one night is not a punishment. It is just basic adulthood. Catherine gasped, pressing a hand to her pearl necklace in a display of theatrical shock. Do not speak to your brother that way. He works incredibly hard. He has a very demanding corporate job. You know he does not have the time to organize these elaborate things. You have the house for it. You have the culinary skill. It is your role, Elijah. It is the least you can do. My role, I repeated, tasting the bitter, metallic tang of the words. I looked at the three of them. I looked at the faces of the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, but who, I had finally realized, only loved what I could provide for them. You think I don't care about this family. You think I am walking away over nothing. You think this is a sudden tantrum. I uncrossed my arms and walked slowly, deliberately, toward the center of the room. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen to wake it up. The room fell utterly silent. Even Matthew stopped his pacing, his eyes narrowing in deep suspicion as he watched my hands. Trust me, I said, locking eyes with my mother, letting her see the absolute void where my affection for her used to reside. I care. I care a lot. In fact, I care so much that I started paying very close attention to exactly how this family operates when you think I am out of earshot. I placed the phone flat on the glass surface of the coffee table, right next to Catherine's untouched cup of tea. I opened an audio file. I hit play. The audio was crystal clear, recorded just 2 weeks prior. It started with the sound of a car door shutting, followed by my mother's unmistakable, sharp, complaining voice. I swear, if he makes that heavy risotto again, I am going to lose my mind. Her recorded voice complained through the small speaker. It is like eating wet cement. In the living room, Catherine's face instantly lost all its color. Her mouth dropped open, a sharp intake of breath hitching in her throat as she recognized her own malicious tone. The recording continued. It was Matthew's voice next, letting out a loud, mocking groan. Just tell him it is dry. Tell him it lacks flavor. You know how desperate he is for your approval, Mom. If you criticize it, he will just try harder next time. And hey, as long as he keeps playing the free caterer, I do not have to dip into my salary to take my clients out. Let him slave over the stove. I need to save up for the new house, and groceries aren't getting any cheaper. Then the final, devastating blow. My father's voice, a careless, low murmur that carried the ultimate betrayal. Just let him do it, Catherine. Keeps him busy. Keeps him quiet. Do not rock the boat if the ride is completely free. I let the recording play out to the very end, letting the silence that followed stretch and expand until it filled every single corner of the room. It was quieter than a funeral in that house. I looked down at them, drinking in the sight of their shattered illusions. Matthew looked like he had been struck by a physical blow to the stomach. His mouth was opening and closing, but no words came out. His face, previously red with anger, was now pale, coated in a thin sheen of absolute shock. Catherine's eyes were darting wildly around the room, panicking, as if looking for an escape route from her own words. She gripped the armrest of the sofa so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. David finally looked up, his eyes wide, his expression a mixture of profound guilt and sheer panic. The power dynamic in the room shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The invisible chains they had wrapped around my neck for years simply dissolved into thin air. I picked up my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and looked at the people who shared my blood. If they wanted to know why I had become so cold, if they wanted to understand how we got to this exact moment of total destruction, they needed to remember where it all started. Because this explosion was not sudden. It was a slow burn, a fuse that had been lit 10 long, exhausting years ago. 10 years ago, my life looked vastly different. I was 22 years old, fresh out of culinary school, full of naive optimism, and incredibly eager to prove myself to the world. But mostly, I wanted to prove myself to my family. I had just scraped together enough money for the down payment on my first home, a small, charming little place nestled in the mountains of Asheville. It was definitely not a mansion, but it had beautiful, original hardwood floors that I had sanded and refinished with my own 2 hands, and a dining room just large enough to fit a proper table for a gathering. That year, I excitedly volunteered to host Thanksgiving. I wanted to show my parents that I was doing well, that I was an adult capable of taking care of them for once. I wanted to give them a space to relax. I spent an entire week planning the menu down to the smallest detail. I woke up before dawn to brine the massive turkey in apple cider and peppercorns. I drove to 3 different farmers markets across town to find the absolute freshest herbs and heirloom vegetables. I spent hours meticulously setting the table, folding the heavy linen napkins into intricate shapes, polishing the antique silverware I had found at a thrift store until it shined like mirrors. I wanted the house to smell like rosemary, citrus, and wood smoke from the fireplace. I wanted it to be an absolute haven. When they arrived that first year, their reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. There were warm smiles. There were actual hugs. There was genuine laughter echoing off the freshly painted walls. My mother complimented the sage and sausage stuffing, saying it was better than her mother's. My father actually had a second plate of food, a rare occurrence. Matthew patted me on the back, holding a beer, and told me I threw a genuinely great party. For a brief, fleeting moment, sitting at the head of that table, I felt like the glue holding our family together. I felt seen. I felt loved. I felt like I finally had a secure place in their hearts. But looking back with the clarity of hindsight, that Thanksgiving was the bait. It was the heavy steel trap slowly snapping shut around my ankle. Because from that day forward, the expectation was permanently set in stone. I was no longer just a son or a younger brother. I became the family venue. I became the free event planner, the unpaid executive chef, the live-in maid for every single occasion on the calendar. It snowballed with terrifying speed. Thanksgiving led directly to Christmas. Christmas led to Easter brunch. Then came the birthdays, the 4th of July barbecues, the Labor Day cookouts, and eventually, the random Sunday dinners when Catherine simply didn't feel like turning on her oven or paying for a restaurant. At first, I honestly didn't mind. I convinced myself this was simply what a good son did. I told myself that acts of service were my love language, and this was how I showed I cared. I completely ignored the bone-deep exhaustion that seeped into my muscles after standing in the hot kitchen for 14 hours straight. I ignored the massive grocery bills that were slowly but surely draining my meager savings account. I just wanted to see them gathered around my table, smiling. But slowly, over the years, the warmth completely drained out of the tradition. The thank yous grew shorter, more perfunctory, until they vanished entirely. The warm hugs at the door turned into brief, obligatory nods, or sometimes just a complaint about the traffic. They stopped asking if I could host and started informing me that I would be hosting. A text message would light up my phone on a random Wednesday afternoon while I was at work. It would be from Matthew. Coming over for dinner on Sunday at 6. Make sure there is steak. I'm craving a ribeye. Not a question. Not a polite request. Just a directive, as if I were a short-order cook waiting on his command. When Sunday arrived, Matthew would walk through my front door, drop his heavy coat on my favorite armchair, and head straight to the couch to turn on whatever sports game was playing. He never offered to chop a vegetable. He never offered to pour the wine. He just waited impatiently to be served. He loved to brag about his 6-figure salary, loudly discussing his end-of-year bonuses, his stock options, and his growing investment portfolio. Yet he never once offered to chip in a single dollar for the massive, expensive prime rib I was roasting in the kitchen. He claimed he was saving every penny for his future kids' college fund, so his money was strictly off-limits. My money, apparently, was public domain. My mother, Catherine, evolved from a gracious guest into a harsh, relentless food critic. She would walk into my kitchen, her heels clicking aggressively on the tile floor, and immediately start lifting the lids off my simmering pots, releasing the steam into the air. She would sniff the sauces, wrinkle her nose in disgust, and shake her head mournfully. "You used regular butter for this?" she would ask, her tone dripping with intense disappointment, as if I had poisoned the food. "Elijah, you know we are trying to eat cleaner." You really need to be more considerate of our cardiovascular health. This is just irresponsible. She commanded the room like a wealthy matriarch dividing up a massive inheritance. If I made a rich, creamy seafood chowder, she complained it completely lacked refinement and sat too heavy in her stomach. If I baked crusty, artisan sourdough bread from scratch, she sighed loudly, remarking that my grandmother's bread had been much softer and easier to chew. Nothing was ever right. The goalposts were constantly moving, ensuring I could never actually win. The worst incident, the one that truly cemented her cruelty in my mind, happened during a random dinner in late October. I had spent 5 agonizing hours making a complex, slow-cooked butternut squash and sage risotto. It required constant stirring, constant attention, and perfect timing. When I finally brought the steaming, fragrant bowl to the table, hoping for at least a tiny nod of approval, Catherine took one small, tentative bite. She chewed slowly, her eyes fixed blankly on the wall. Then, she set her silver fork down with a loud, dramatic clatter against the porcelain plate. "Heavy food, Elijah," she muttered, pushing the plate away from her as if it deeply offended her sensibilities. "It sits like a brick. You should really think lighter next time. This is just clumsy cooking. A heavy hand in the kitchen is the mark of an amateur." I felt my chest tighten, a lump forming in my throat. I looked across the table at Matthew, desperately hoping he might defend me, just once. Instead, Matthew just laughed around a massive mouthful of the risotto. "Yeah, bro, I am going to need a lawyer to defend my diet if you keep feeding us this heavy stuff. There's too much calories. Keep it light next time." I looked at my father. David just sat at the head of the table, his shoulders slouched. He took another bite of the risotto, chewing quietly. He heard every single insult. He saw my face fall, the light leaving my eyes. But he said absolutely nothing. He just shrugged, looking down at his plate, confirming that my feelings were completely irrelevant. His silence was a thick, suffocating blanket that wrapped tightly around my throat. Things escalated to an entirely new level of disrespect when Matthew realized my dinners could actually benefit him professionally. Without asking me, without even a warning text message, the doorbell rang one Sunday evening. I opened it to find Matthew standing on my porch with 3 strange men dressed in expensive, tailored suits. "Hey man," Matthew said casually, brushing right past me into the hallway. "Brought some guys from the firm. Samuel here is a huge fan of barbecue, so I told him my little brother makes the absolute best ribs in town. Thought we'd do a little networking." I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the strangers taking off their shoes. I had prepared a modest meal for 4 people, not a massive feast for 7 grown men. I had to sprint to the kitchen, scrambling to stretch the food, digging into the depths of my freezer to find frozen appetizers, sweating profusely over the stove while Matthew sat comfortably in my living room, pouring my expensive, aged whiskey for his colleagues. He used my home, my intense labor, and my money to impress his boss in hopes of securing a massive promotion and a salary bump. He didn't introduce me as the homeowner or the chef who was feeding them. He introduced me with a dismissive wave of his hand, like I was the hired help, the catering staff. And the uninvited guests never apologized for the intrusion. They just ate my food, drank half a bottle of my liquor, talked loudly about their golf swings, and left my house a total, disastrous mess. My neighbor, Carter, saw the depressing aftermath the next morning while I was dragging 3 massive, heavy trash bags to the curb in the freezing cold. Carter was an older guy, retired military, sharp-eyed and brutally blunt. He walked over, leaning against the chain-link fence separating our properties, watching me aggressively scrub a massive, grease-stained roasting pan with a freezing garden hose. "You throw a lot of parties, Elijah?" Carter noted, taking a slow sip of his black coffee from a thermal mug. "Family dinners," I corrected him defensively, wiping a mixture of sweat and freezing water from my forehead. "Just doing my part to keep everyone together." Carter studied my face for a long, uncomfortable moment. He didn't smile. His eyes were intensely serious. "I see your brother driving up here in his fancy sports car every weekend. I see your mother marching up those steps like she owns the entire block. But you know what I never see? Son? I never see them carrying a grocery bag. I never see them bringing a bottle of wine. I never see them taking out the trash when they leave. I looked away, staring at the soapy water pooling on the concrete, feeling a sudden, intense flush of hot embarrassment creep up my neck. It's fine. It's family. You don't keep score with family. Elijah, Carter said, his voice dropping to a serious, warning tone that commanded attention. You are bleeding yourself dry to keep them warm. You are buying their company with your sweat and your paycheck. You are way too generous to people who do not even know how to spell the words, thank you. His words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I laughed it off awkwardly, pretending I didn't know what he meant, insisting he was misreading the situation. But long after he walked back into his house, his warning echoed loudly in my mind. He was right. I wasn't a beloved son or an equal brother to them. I was a resource, and resources are meant to be relentlessly depleted until there is nothing left. That brief conversation planted a tiny, hard seed of deep resentment in my chest. It grew quietly over the next few months, feeding on every ignored text message, every cruel, backhanded compliment about my cooking, every empty, expensive wine bottle I had to throw away on Monday mornings. The foundation of our relationship was violently cracking, and the total collapse was inevitable. It all finally came crashing down the year I tried one last, desperate time to give them the perfect Christmas. By the time late December finally rolled around, the tension building inside my chest felt like a tightly coiled metal spring, ready to snap at any second. I was exhausted, physically run down, and financially drained from a year of funding their weekly feasts. But some small, incredibly desperate part of my inner child still believed I could fix it. I foolishly told myself that if I could just execute a flawless holiday, if the food was spectacular, if the house looked like a magazine cover, if I anticipated their every need, they would finally see my effort. They would finally drop their harsh armor, apologize for taking me for granted, and give me the genuine love and respect I had been starving for over the last 10 years. I went completely, absurdly overboard. I spent nearly $2,000 on groceries, imported wines, and lavish decorations. I bought a massive, fresh-cut noble fir tree that barely fit in the living room and spent 6 hours stringing it with hundreds of warm white lights and delicate glass ornaments. I polished the antique silverware I had bought at an estate sale until my fingers ached. I carefully ironed the heavy linen tablecloths to remove every single crease. I planned a menu that would have severely stressed out a professional restaurant kitchen brigade. A perfectly roasted prime rib with a complex red wine reduction, seared jumbo scallops with brown butter, a rich, Gruyere potato gratin, roasted root vegetables tossed in a honey thyme glaze, and 3 different types of intricate, homemade desserts. I didn't sleep for 2 entire days. My lower back throbbed with a dull ache. My fingers were burned and calloused from the hot pans, but I pushed through the pain with a manic energy. When I finally pulled the massive prime rib out of the oven to rest on the cutting board, the entire house smelled absolutely incredible. The dining table glowed beautifully under the warm candlelight, the crystal glasses sparkling. It was, objectively speaking, a masterpiece of hospitality. At exactly 4 p.m., the front door swung open violently without a knock. They had arrived. There was no warm greeting, no cheerful Merry Christmas. No, wow, the house looks beautiful, Elijah. Matthew walked in first, stomping clumps of dirty snow off his heavy boots directly onto my freshly vacuumed rug. He threw his wet winter coat over the back of a pristine dining chair, completely ignoring the empty coat rack standing right next to him. Catherine followed close behind, brushing past me with a curt, barely there nod. She walked straight into the dining room, her sharp eyes scanning the elaborate table, setting like a health inspector, desperately looking for a violation to write up. David trailed slowly behind them, hands shoved deep in his pockets, offering a quiet, non-committal grunt in my general direction. "Did you turn the heat down in here?" Catherine asked immediately, wrapping her expensive cashmere cardigan tighter around her shoulders and shivering dramatically. It feels like a literal refrigerator in here. Elijah, we are all going to catch pneumonia before the appetizers are even served. It's set to 72 degrees, Mom, I said softly, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter to steady my trembling hands. Well, it feels terribly drafty, she snapped, moving to inspect the food I had carefully laid out on the buffet. She lifted the foil covering the bubbling potato gratin, releasing a cloud of steam, and immediately frowned. You used Gruyere cheese again? You know Matthew doesn't like strong cheeses. Why do you always have to make things so needlessly complicated? Simple, plain mashed potatoes would have been perfectly fine. Now he has nothing to eat. I felt a muscle jump erratically in my jaw. It's a classic French recipe, Mom. I thought. You thought wrong, she interrupted sharply, dropping the foil back down with a crinkle. She sighed heavily, a sound of profound martyrdom. I suppose we will just have to make do. As always, we will survive. I retreated into the kitchen, my hands shaking violently with a confusing mixture of deep rage and profound, crushing sadness. I poured myself a glass of ice water, gripping the cold glass, desperately trying to steady my breathing before I lost control. It was happening again. The exact same cycle. No matter what I did, no matter how much money I spent or how much I physically bled for them, it was never, ever enough. 10 excruciating minutes later, I called everyone to the table. We sat down. The silence was thick and oppressive, broken only by the clinking of heavy silverware against porcelain plates. Matthew loaded his plate, taking massive, greedy portions of the prime rib and completely ignoring the carefully roasted vegetables. He didn't speak to me. Instead, he pulled out his smartphone and started texting rapidly under the table, laughing quietly to himself at whatever was on his screen. Matthew, please put the phone away, I said, trying to keep my voice even and calm. It's Christmas dinner. Can we just be present for an hour? Matthew rolled his eyes dramatically, tossing the phone onto the linen tablecloth with a thud. Relax, Elijah. It's just Dylan. He was asking how the royal banquet was going and if I survived the appetizers. Dylan was a guy I had known since my freshman year of college. We weren't absolute best friends, but we hung out occasionally, grabbing beers after work. I had invited him over for drinks later that evening. Oh, Catherine chimed in, suddenly interested, taking a tiny, delicate bite of the prime rib. And what exactly did you tell him? Matthew let out a short, incredibly cruel laugh. I told him the food was decent, but the atmosphere was as tense as a messy divorce settlement. Honestly, Elijah, you always look so stressed out and miserable when you host. It ruins the vibe for everyone else. You need to lighten up and stop taking yourself so seriously. I stared at him, my vision actually blurring slightly at the edges. I look stressed because I have been cooking for 2 days straight, entirely alone, while you walk in here and do absolutely nothing but complain. Matthew scoffed loudly, waving his fork at me. Hey, nobody asked you to go crazy, man. You chose to make all this fancy crap to show off. Do not sit there and play the bleeding martyr just because you want a medal for boiling some potatoes. My father finally cleared his throat, staring fixedly at his water glass, desperate to avoid eye contact. Boys, let's just eat. Don't start this tonight. Not on Christmas. The rest of the dinner was a horrifying blur of passive-aggressive comments, subtle digs, and suffocating tension. I barely touched my own food. The expensive prime rib tasted like dry ash in my mouth. Then came the final blow, the moment that cleanly snapped the camel's back, breaking 10 years of conditioning in a single instant. It was time for dessert. I stood up, taking a deep breath, ready to go to the kitchen to bring out the delicate chocolate tarts and the complex, homemade pear galette I had spent 3 meticulous hours assembling that morning. Before I could take a step, Matthew stood up from his chair. Hold on, I got this, he said, an incredibly smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. He walked confidently into my kitchen. I heard the refrigerator door open and close. He walked back into the dining room holding a bright orange, cheap plastic container. It was a store-bought, mass-produced pumpkin pie. The kind you buy at the discount supermarket for $5. It looked rubbery and sad. He set it right in the dead center of the table, pushing aside the crystal candle holders to make room. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely a raspy whisper. "Insurance," Matthew said brightly, pulling off the plastic lid with a loud pop. "Dylan actually texted me earlier today," he said. "Knowing your brother, he'll make some weird, complicated dessert nobody likes. Let me drop off a real pie so you guys actually have something good to eat." So, he left this on the porch for me an hour before we got here. My own friend, Dylan. He had colluded with Matthew, my main tormentor, to humiliate me in my own home on Christmas Day. Catherine let out a genuine, delighted laugh, clapping her hands together softly. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, eagerly reaching for a cake knife. "I was honestly dreading whatever heavy, overly sweet pastry you had planned. Elijah, this looks wonderful, so traditional, so simple." David chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of complete agreement. He actually smiled as he looked at the cheap pie. I looked at the artificial, glowing orange pie sitting on my antique linen tablecloth. I looked at my mother's eager, greedy face. I looked at my father's approving, relaxed smile. I looked at Matthew, who was staring directly at me with a look of absolute, victorious defiance, reveling in his ability to crush me. Something inside my chest finally gave way. It wasn't a loud, dramatic explosion. It was a quiet, clean, irreversible break. The desperate need for their approval, the endless, exhausting well of patience I had drawn from for 10 years, the desire to be a good son. It all evaporated into the air in a single, defining second. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over my brain, sharp and incredibly focusing. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I slowly reached behind my back and untied the knot of my apron. I pulled it over my head, folded it neatly, and placed it on the back of my chair. "Elijah?" Catherine asked, pausing with the pie knife hovering in the air, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer her. I turned my back to the table, walked out of the dining room, and stepped into the living room. I walked straight over to the massive, glowing Christmas tree I had spent hours decorating. I reached down to the wall outlet, grabbed the thick green cord, and violently yanked it out of the socket. The hundreds of lights died instantly, plunging that side of the room into dark, heavy shadows. In the dining room, forks paused in midair. The silence was absolute, deafening. I walked back to the doorway. I looked at the three of them sitting at my carefully curated table, eating the food I bought with my hard-earned salary, sitting in the house I paid the mortgage for. "I am done," I said. My voice was eerily calm. It didn't shake. It carried the chilling weight of absolute finality. "I am absolutely, completely done. I am never hosting another holiday. I am never cooking another meal for you. Not for Thanksgiving, not for Christmas, not for a random Sunday. Ever again." Matthew blinked rapidly, his smugness faltering for a fraction of a second as he realized I wasn't joking. "Bro, are you seriously throwing a massive fit over a cheap pie? Grow up." "It's not about the pie, Matthew," I said, locking eyes with him, letting him see the utter contempt I now held for him. "It is about the fact that you are a parasite. All three of you are parasites." Catherine gasped loudly, dropping the knife. It clattered sharply against the table. "How dare you speak to us that way? I am your mother. Get out of my house," I said smoothly, my voice devoid of any emotion. I walked to the front hallway closet, pulled out my heavy wool winter coat, and slid my arms into the sleeves. I grabbed my car keys from the ceramic bowl by the door. "Elijah, stop being so dramatic," David finally spoke up, his voice tinged with genuine panic as he realized I was actually leaving them there. "Where are you going? You can't just leave your own party." "Dinner is on the table," I said, pulling open the heavy front door. The freezing, biting night air swept into the warm hallway, stinging my cheeks. "Clean up when you leave. Make sure the deadbolt locks behind you." I stepped out onto the snowy porch, pulled the door shut behind me with a solid thud, and walked down the driveway to my car. I didn't look back. I didn't care if they screamed at the closed door. I didn't care if they cried fake tears. As I started the engine, turned up the heater, and drove away from my own house on Christmas night, the only thing I felt was the incredibly light, beautiful sensation of oxygen filling my lungs for the first time in a decade. I drove aimlessly around the empty, snow-dusted streets of Asheville for over an hour. The town was eerily quiet, the windows of houses glowing with warm, golden light, families gathered inside opening presents, laughing, or maybe arguing over board games. But they were together. I ended up pulling into the parking lot of a brightly lit, 24-hour diner on the edge of the interstate. I walked in, the bell chiming loudly, and sat down in a cracked vinyl booth in the back corner. I ordered a simple cup of black coffee from the tired waitress and stared out the window into the dark, freezing parking lot. My phone started vibrating violently in my pocket almost immediately. I pulled it out and watched the screen light up with a frantic barrage of text messages. Matthew, you are acting like a total psycho. Come back here right now. Catherine, you have completely ruined Christmas. Your father is incredibly upset. I hope you are happy with yourself, you selfish boy. Matthew, we are leaving. I am not cleaning your massive disaster of a kitchen. You owe Mom a massive apology tomorrow. David, son, please. This is getting totally out of hand. Let's talk like men. I sat there, watching the notifications stack up rapidly on the screen. The old Elijah, the one who existed just hours ago, would have felt a crushing, agonizing weight of guilt. He would have paid the diner tab, rushed home in a panic, scrubbed the kitchen spotless while crying, and sent a long, groveling apology text by morning, begging for forgiveness he didn't even need. Instead, I looked at the texts, felt absolutely nothing but mild disgust, picked up the phone, powered it completely down, and shoved it deep into my coat pocket. I took a slow sip of the bitter, burnt diner coffee. It honestly tasted better than the expensive prime rib I had slaved over. The silence that followed in the weeks immediately after Christmas was not peaceful at first. It was loud, heavy, and pregnant with tension. It was a standoff. My family was waiting for me to crack. They were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable apology, the desperate plea for reconciliation. January passed by in a blur of freezing rain. February arrived with gray skies. I didn't reach out once. I ignored their occasional passive-aggressive text messages completely. I didn't block their numbers. I just let their words sit unread on my screen, effectively stripping them of all their manipulative power. Without the constant, exhausting drain of their demands and criticisms, my life transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined. I suddenly had free time on the weekends to do whatever I wanted. I saved a massive amount of money. My grocery bill plummeted from astronomical to completely reasonable. I started hiking the mountain trails again. I started reading books for pleasure. For the first time in years, I started sleeping through the night. Then came Easter Sunday, the true ultimate test of their forced independence. For 10 straight years, Easter had been a massive, chaotic brunch hosted at my house. I would prepare glazed ham, 3 types of quiches, fresh pastries from scratch, and bottomless mimosas. This year, they had to completely fend for themselves. I didn't attend, of course. I spent Easter Sunday fishing on the lake with Carter, my neighbor, enjoying the quiet morning mist and the simple act of casting a line. But in a town like ours, word travels incredibly fast. I heard all about the absolute disaster through the family grapevine. A cousin of mine called me a few days later, laughing so hard into the phone she could barely catch her breath. Apparently, Matthew, desperately trying to prove to Catherine that he didn't need me and that he was the superior son, had aggressively volunteered to host Easter at his expensive, pristine, sterile apartment. He invited the entire extended family, eager to show off his new leather furniture and his massive television. But Matthew didn't know the first thing about cooking. He didn't know how to time a meal, how to season meat, or how to handle the stress of hosting 15 people. He bought a massive, expensive ham but completely forgot to read the instructions on how long to heat it. panicking when people arrived. He cranked the oven to 450 degrees, trying to rush the process, burning the outside to a dry, black crisp while the inside remained ice cold and raw. He tried to make a simple potato salad but didn't boil the potatoes nearly long enough, leaving them crunchy and inedible. According to my cousin, Catherine completely lost her mind. Deprived of me as her designated punching bag, she turned her critical, laser-focused eye directly onto her golden child. She loudly, ruthlessly berated Matthew in front of aunts, uncles, and his own friends. She told him the food was disgusting and inedible. She complained about the dust on his baseboards. She humiliated him the exact same way she used to humiliate me. Matthew, who possessed a fragile ego and was completely unable to handle even mild criticism, snapped back viciously. He yelled at Catherine, blaming her for not helping him in the kitchen. David, true to form, tried to shrink into the background and disappear, but Catherine dragged him directly into the screaming match, berating him for raising a son who couldn't even manage to cook a simple holiday meal without ruining it. The perfect facade crumbled to dust. The flawless family image they projected to the world completely collapsed the moment I was no longer there to serve as the foundation holding them up, and the lightning rod absorbing all their toxic energy. Matthew ended up ordering greasy pizzas, sulking in his bedroom like a teenager, while the extended family ate in awkward, horrifying silence. Hearing that story didn't make me angry. It didn't even make me feel particularly vindictive or triumphant. It just made me feel an overwhelming, profound sense of clarity. They didn't miss me as a person. They never did. They missed what I did for them. They missed the extreme convenience. They missed having a designated target for their misery. I was the shock absorber for their deeply dysfunctional dynamics, and without me there to take the hits, the car was violently shaking itself to pieces. Sitting in my quiet, clean living room, looking at the empty spot where the Christmas tree used to be, I realized I was entirely safe in the eye of the storm. The chaos was raging wildly around them, destroying their relationships, but it couldn't touch me anymore. But toxic people like Catherine and Matthew don't surrender that easily. When an abuser loses total control of their victim, they don't reflect on their horrible actions. They simply change their tactics. The silence was driving them absolutely crazy, and they needed to drag me back into the fold before the summer holidays began. They needed to force me back into my subservient role by any means necessary. That is what ultimately led to the ambush. That is what led to them sitting in my living room, throwing insults at me, trying to break my spirit one last time. But they didn't realize they weren't dealing with the old Elijah anymore. They were dealing with someone who had spent the last few months quietly, meticulously keeping receipts, and preparing for the ultimate satisfying revenge. The first desperate attempt to reel me back in came on a dreary, rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon in early May. I was sitting at my desk at work when my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, an audio message popped up. It was Catherine. She had used a different phone to bypass my silent treatment. Her voice was dripping with that saccharine, perfectly measured sweetness she reserved for public appearances and manipulation. "Elijah, darling," she cooed through the speaker. "It has been far too long. I know we had a silly little misunderstanding at Christmas, but family is family. I am sitting at that lovely little French cafe downtown, the one with the wonderful croissants you like. Please come down. I bought you a coffee. Let us just talk and put this behind us." A silly little misunderstanding. That is what she called a decade of financial and emotional exploitation. I initially wanted to delete the message and block the number, but a quiet, calculating voice in my head told me to go. I needed to see exactly what her game was. I needed to look her in the eye one last time to ensure the guilt was truly gone. Before I left my office, I opened the voice memo app on my phone and made sure it was running. I slipped the phone into the breast pocket of my jacket. The cafe was warm and smelled heavily of roasted espresso and butter. Catherine was sitting in a plush corner booth, wearing a tailored trench coat, stirring a porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea with slow, practiced grace. When she saw me, Her lips stretched into a wide, entirely lifeless smile. "Oh, sweet boy," she said, reaching across the small marble table to pat my hand. I pulled my hand back before she could make contact. Her smile faltered, her eyes flashing with a brief spark of irritation before she smoothed her features back into a mask of maternal concern. "Cut the act, Mom," I said, keeping my voice low and steady as I sat across from her. "What do you want? I have a job to get back to." She sighed, a dramatic, breathy sound. "You are so defensive, Elijah. You are acting like a bitter ex-husband in a messy divorce over a few burnt potatoes. It is beneath you. I asked you here because I want to extend an olive branch. Summer is approaching. We have the 4th of July coming up, and your father's birthday is in August. The family needs to gather." "And you need a caterer," I replied bluntly. "I need my son," she countered, leaning forward. "Elijah, you have had your little break. You threw your tantrum and we gave you space. But you have to understand that family means sacrifice. You have a beautiful house. You have a gift for cooking. God gave you that talent so you could serve your loved ones. Refusing to use it is just selfish. Do you really want to be remembered as the son who abandoned his parents?" I stared at her, feeling a cold knot of absolute disgust tighten in my stomach. She truly believed her own lies. She believed I existed solely to be consumed by her and Matthew. "I sacrificed for 10 years, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I cooked, I cleaned, I paid for everything. And all I got in return were insults and uninvited guests. I am not hosting anymore. You can hire a caterer with that massive inheritance you always brag about getting from Grandpa." Catherine's eyes narrowed into tiny, furious slits. The motherly facade dropped completely, revealing the venomous predator underneath. "You ungrateful little brat," she hissed, her voice trembling with genuine rage. "You think you are so special because you can roast a piece of meat? You are nothing without this family. You have no wife, no kids, nothing but an empty house. We gave you a purpose. If you walk away from us, you will die completely alone, and nobody will even notice. Do not think you can punish us and get away with it." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood up, looked down at her contorted face, and walked out of the cafe into the rain. I had exactly what I needed. The audio file was safely saved on my phone. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought my refusal would finally force them to back off. But narcissists do not accept defeat. They simply escalate. 2 days later, I pulled into my driveway after a long day at the office. The moment my headlights swept across the front of my house, my heart stopped. Matthew's expensive luxury sedan was parked crookedly on the curb. My parents' SUV was jammed into my driveway. The front door of my house was slightly ajar. Panic flared in my chest. I threw my car into park, grabbed my briefcase, and rushed up the porch steps. I had given my father a spare key 5 years ago for emergencies. They had used it to break into my sanctuary. I pushed the door open. That brings us right back to the moment I described at the very beginning of this story. Matthew standing by the fireplace, screaming about me tearing the family apart. Catherine sitting on my velvet couch, calling me cold and pathetic. David staring at his shoes. They had ambushed me in my own home, thinking they could corner me and bully me into submission. But I was ready. I walked into the center of the room, pulled my phone from my pocket, and played the audio recording from Christmas. The one where Catherine insulted the food, Matthew bragged about saving his salary, and David told them to use me. As the recording played, their faces drained of blood. Matthew's jaw went slack. Catherine clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with absolute horror. They thought the recording was the worst thing I had in my arsenal. They thought being exposed for their cruel words was the climax of my revenge. But I wasn't finished. When the audio ended, the silence in the living room was deafening. I calmly put my phone away. Then, I unlatched my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, manila folder. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying smack right in front of Matthew. "What is that?" Matthew stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all its previous bravado. That, I said, pointing at the folder, is a detailed compilation of receipts, dates, and photographic evidence. You see, Matthew, after Christmas, I had a lot of free time. So I started thinking about all those Sunday dinners. I started thinking about all those expensive cuts of meat and bottles of wine I bought to feed your random colleagues and clients. And then I made a phone call to Samuel, that guy you brought over last October. Matthew's face turned an ashen, sickly gray. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes glued to the folder. It turns out, I continued, my voice ringing clear and loud in the silent room, that you have been submitting expense reports to your corporate accounting department for every single one of those dinners. You were claiming you took these clients out to high-end steakhouses. You forged restaurant receipts and pocketed the massive reimbursements from your company. You literally stole thousands of dollars from your employer, using the food I bought and cooked with my own salary as your free cover. Catherine gasped, turning to stare at her golden child. Matthew? What is he talking about? It gets better, Mom, I said, not taking my eyes off my brother's terrified face. He didn't just use that stolen money for his new house. While he was sitting at my table eating the food he complained about, he was padding his bank account with corporate fraud. And I have every text message, every date, and a signed statement from Samuel confirming he was eating at a private residence, not a restaurant. Matthew looked like he was going to vomit. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. Elijah, please, he whispered, all the arrogance completely stripped away. That is corporate fraud. If the company lawyers see that, if they fire me, I will lose everything. My house, my stock options, everything. You should have thought about that before you called me a parasite in my own home, I said coldly. I looked at my parents. Catherine was physically shaking, her perfect image of her successful son shattered into pieces. David was staring at Matthew with a look of profound, sickening disappointment. Get out, I commanded, my voice booming through the room. All three of you, get out of my house. Leave your keys on the counter, and never, ever speak to me again. They didn't argue. They didn't yell. They practically scrambled over each other to get out the front door, fleeing from the truth they could no longer deny. As the door clicked shut behind them, I stood alone in my living room, the crushing weight of a decade entirely lifted from my shoulders. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment one below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The morning after the ambush, I woke up before the sun. The house was completely silent, but for the first time in years, it wasn't a lonely silence. It was a peaceful, expansive quiet. I walked into the dining room and stared at the massive, 10-seater mahogany table taking up almost the entire space. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, but to me it was a monument to my own subjugation. It was the altar where I had sacrificed my time, my money, and my self-worth. I didn't want it in my house anymore. I took out my phone, snapped a few pictures, and listed the table, along with the matching buffet and all the extra dining chairs, on a local community marketplace app for a fraction of its actual value. Within an hour, I had a buyer. That afternoon, a young woman named Chloe arrived with a rented moving truck and two of her friends. She was bright-eyed, energetic, and newly engaged. She looked at the massive table with absolute wonder. It is gorgeous, she breathed, running her hand over the polished wood. My fiancé and I are hosting our very first Thanksgiving this year, and we have a huge, blended family coming. We couldn't afford anything this nice brand new. Why are you selling it? I smiled, feeling a genuine warmth spread through my chest. It held a lot of people for a long time, I told her honestly. But my gatherings are going to be a lot smaller from now on. I want it to go to a home that actually appreciates the people sitting around it. Watching them carry that massive, heavy table out of my front door was a profound physical release. With every inch it moved over the threshold, a corresponding weight lifted off my lungs. I followed them out, helped them load it into the truck, and waved goodbye. When I walked back inside, the dining room echoed. It was empty. It was a blank canvas. I immediately called a locksmith and had every single lock on my exterior doors changed. The fortress was finally secure. While I was completely purging my house of their memory, the storm I had unleashed was actively destroying their carefully constructed world. I didn't actually send the folder of evidence to Matthew's corporate HR department. I didn't need to. Matthew's paranoia did the job for me. Terrified that the company lawyers were already investigating him, Matthew started frantically trying to cover his tracks at work. He deleted files, altered expense reports retroactively, and acted so incredibly erratic that his boss became suspicious. They launched an internal audit within the week. When they discovered the discrepancies and the sheer volume of his fraudulent meal expenses, the fallout was instantaneous and brutal. Matthew wasn't just fired. He was escorted out of the building by security in front of his entire department. The company threatened criminal charges if he didn't immediately repay the thousands of dollars he had stolen. Suddenly, the golden child with the six-figure salary was unemployed, facing massive corporate debt, and completely unhireable in his industry. The new luxury house he was building, he had to pull out of the contract, losing his massive deposit. Catherine, meanwhile, tried to control the narrative. Desperate to maintain her image as the perfect matriarch in our community, she attempted to host a massive summer barbecue for her church group and all our extended relatives. She wanted to prove she was the glue of the family, not me. It was an unmitigated disaster. She tried to hire a cheap catering company at the last minute to save money, but the food arrived cold and flavorless. When her friends politely asked where I was, Catherine tried to play the victim, spinning a lie about how I had abandoned the family over a petty argument. But the truth is a stubborn thing. Carter, my blunt, observant neighbor, happened to be at that barbecue. He didn't yell and he didn't make a scene. He just sat on a lawn chair, sipping a beer, and loudly recounted the exact conversation he had with me about my family treating me like an unpaid servant. He told everyone how they never lifted a finger, how they complained about free food, and how Matthew had been using my house for his corporate scam. The gossip spread like wildfire. In a community that values hard work and family loyalty, exploiting your own son for free labor and corporate fraud was the ultimate social sin. Catherine and David found themselves suddenly isolated. The phone stopped ringing. The invitations to dinner parties completely dried up. When Catherine walked through the grocery store, people avoided eye contact and whispered behind her back. The social humiliation was a punishment far worse than anything I could have ever inflicted on her myself. She worshipped status, and her status was entirely obliterated. The heavy, crushing judgment of the community had finally fallen squarely on the people who deserved it. 6 months passed. The blazing heat of summer faded into the crisp, beautiful chill of autumn. The leaves in the Asheville Mountains turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. My life had settled into a rhythm so peaceful and fulfilling, it almost felt like a dream. I had replaced the massive dining table with a small, beautiful round oak table that comfortably seated 4 people. It sat directly in the center of the room under a warm pendant light. On a chilly Friday evening in November, that small table was perfectly set. The air smelled of roasting garlic, fresh thyme, and baking bread. I was hosting dinner, but this time it was entirely on my own terms. Carter sat to my right, laughing heartily as he poured a deep red wine into our glasses. Chloe, the young woman who had bought my old table, sat across from me with her new husband. We had kept in touch after the sale, bonding over our shared love of cooking. The dinner was simple, a rustic chicken stew with root vegetables and a crusty baguette, but it was prepared with absolute joy. There were no complaints about the food being too heavy. There were no passive-aggressive sighs. There were no uninvited guests crashing the evening. There was just genuine conversation, loud laughter, and a deep, abiding respect for the effort I had put into the meal. As I looked around that small table, Listening to the clinking of glasses and the warmth of real friendship, I realized that my home finally reflected who I was. Joy had taken the permanent seat that duty and obligation had occupied for a decade. The universe has a funny way of rewarding you when you finally stand up for your own worth. A few weeks later, I volunteered to run the kitchen for a local charity gala aimed at raising funds for a children's hospital. I spent 3 days prepping a massive menu, pouring all the culinary passion I had rediscovered into the food. During the event, a man in a sharp suit walked into the bustling kitchen. He had a stern face and intensely observing eyes. It was Gabriel, the executive chef and owner of 3 of the most prestigious, high-end restaurants in the state. I recognized him immediately from magazines. He walked directly up to my prep station, picked up a tasting spoon, and sampled the complex, dark cherry reduction I was finishing for the duck dish. He closed his eyes, tasting it slowly. My heart pounded against my ribs. He opened his eyes and looked at me. "Who taught you how to balance acid and fat like this?" he asked, his voice rough. "I taught myself mostly," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron. "Trial and error in my home kitchen." Chef Gabriel nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. "You have an incredible palate, son. This is exceptional work. I am opening a new, intimate farm-to-table concept downtown next spring. I need a head chef who understands flavor over flash. I want you to come to my office on Monday. Let's talk about a real salary and a creative partnership." I stood there, stunned. For 10 years, my own mother told me my cooking was clumsy and heavy. My brother treated me like a cheap diner cook. And here was one of the best chefs in the region, validating my talent and offering me the opportunity of a lifetime. I accepted the job the very next day. I was thriving. My career was launching, my friendships were deep, and my bank account was growing. But karma, it seems, always has one final act to play. It happened 2 nights before Thanksgiving. The air outside was freezing, threatening snow. I was sitting in my living room, reading a book by the fire, when the heavy, frantic pounding started at my front door. I frowned, setting my book down. I didn't recognize the desperate rhythm of the knock. I walked to the door, flipped on the porch light, and looked through the peephole. It was Matthew. He looked absolutely terrible. He was thinner, his expensive haircut was shaggy and unkempt, and he was wearing a wrinkled coat. Standing right behind him, looking older and more defeated than I had ever seen him, was my father, David. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, keeping the security chain firmly attached. The cold air rushed in. "Elijah," Matthew gasped, his breath pluming in the freezing air. His eyes were wide and frantic. "Thank God you are home. Let us in. Please, man, it is freezing." "The door stays closed, Matthew," I said evenly, crossing my arms. "What do you want?" Matthew's face crumpled, and to my absolute shock, genuine tears welled up in his eyes. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by total desperation. "I need your help, Elijah. I am drowning. Since the company fired me, I haven't been able to find a job. The lawyers drained my savings. I maxed out my credit cards trying to keep up appearances, and the bank is foreclosing on my condo next week. I have nothing left. My college fund for my future kids? It's gone. It's all gone." He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white. "Mom won't give me a dime. She says I embarrassed her. Please, Elijah, let me move into your guest room for a few months, just until I get back on my feet. I'll do anything. I'll clean the kitchen. I'll help you cook. Please, you are my brother." I looked at him. This was the man who had laughed while I suffered. This was the man who stole from his company and used me as his shield. He didn't want a brother. He wanted a financial buffer. He wanted a free hotel. Before I could answer, David stepped forward. He looked down at his shoes just like he always did, but then he slowly raised his head and looked me directly in the eye. "Elijah," my father said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I sat there for 10 years and let them treat you like dirt because I was too much of a coward to stop it. I see that now. I see what we lost. Please, son, Help your brother. Be the bigger person. Do it for me. Hearing my father finally apologize, hearing him actually acknowledge his cowardice and the pain he allowed, sent a strange ripple through my chest. 10 years ago, an apology from David would have meant the world to me. It would have healed wounds and changed the course of my life. But looking at him now, standing on my freezing porch demanding I save the golden child who had tormented me, I realized something profound. An apology without changed behavior is just manipulation. He wasn't apologizing to heal my pain. He was apologizing to use me one last time to fix Matthew's mess, so he wouldn't have to deal with it himself. I appreciate the apology, Dad, I said, my voice incredibly calm. I really do, but it is 10 years too late. I looked back at Matthew, whose tears were spilling down his cheeks. You told me once that asking you to help around the house was a punishment, I said softly, locking eyes with my brother. Consider this your basic adulthood. Figure it out. I didn't wait for him to scream or beg. I firmly shut the heavy wooden door, the click of the latch echoing loudly in the quiet house. I slid the deadbolt securely into place. I stood there for a moment, listening to Matthew sob on the porch, listening to David's heavy footsteps walking away. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I felt an absolute, unshakable peace. I turned off the porch light, walked back into my warm living room, and sat down by the fire to finish my book. A few weeks later, I stood alone by the edge of the French Broad River. The sun was dipping low over the mountains, painting the moving water in brilliant, fiery shades of gold and deep purple. The winter breeze was sharp, but my heavy coat kept me warm. I watched the water rush past the smooth stones, completely untethered, completely free. That was exactly how my chest felt. For the majority of my life, I believed a dangerous lie. I believed that family was a blood contract you could never break, no matter how much it damaged you. I believed that if I just loved them hard enough, if I sacrificed enough of my own happiness, I could eventually buy their respect. I spent a decade setting myself entirely on fire just to keep them warm, and they complained about the smell of the smoke. But walking away from that dining room table taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Family is not defined by the people who share your last name, or the people who demand your loyalty because of a biological accident. True family is defined by the people who honor your boundaries. It is defined by the people who sit at your table and say, "Thank you," instead of "What's next?" Leaving a toxic environment does not make you cold. It does not make you selfish. Cutting off access to your energy when it is constantly abused is the ultimate act of self-respect. I had to become the villain in their heavily fabricated story so that I could finally become the hero in my own real life. And standing there by the river, breathing in the crisp air, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never, ever go back to the dark. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a long journey, but it is one I needed to share. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you are currently pouring your heart into people who take you for granted. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, giving everything you have to family members who never appreciate it? How did you finally draw the line? I would love to read your experiences down in the comments. And finally, for the amazing people who made it all the way to the very end of this video, I have a special request for you. I want to see who the real ones are. Go down to the comments right now and just drop the letter W. W stands for winner. It is the secret code for the 1% Club, the incredible group of you who have the attention span and the empathy to listen to a full story and truly connect. When I see that W, I will know exactly who you are, and I will know that you are a winner in your own life, taking back your own power. If my story helped you feel a little less alone today, please hit that like button, and don't forget to follow or subscribe so we can keep sharing these journeys together. Take care of yourselves, set your boundaries, and I will see you in the next one.